Questions from the committee? Mr. Chesbro, then Mr. Ting.
Professor Thompson, I was struck by your comments about the differences between developmental differences and differences in terms of what they need by way of early education between 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and 7-year-olds. Are there implications of that for the type of teacher training and approaches to education that would be taken at those different levels?
Yes, there are. And I think that they arise in part because the kind of support for learning that is necessary where young children are concerned are not the same supports that are necessary with older kids. Children in grade school, especially as they get older, are self-regulated learners. They can sit at desks and do things well by themselves. They also enjoy group activity. By contrast, young children are not self-regulated learners. They require a great deal of relational support to capitalize something that sparked their curiosity into a real learning opportunity. That's where a skilled educator can do. So the implication then is that one who is going to work effectively in an early education context has to know a lot about how children are developing during this time, about where brain development is, self-regulation, and so forth. Just in much the same way that a K-12 teacher needs to understand the characteristics of children developing throughout that spectrum. Is that helpful?
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Ting. And Ms. Skinner.
So as the father of a preschooler, this topic is very near and dear to my heart. I do have a question sort of for both of you, which is part of this budget hearing is to sort of discuss how we look at child care and preschool and transitional kindergarten. And I was going to ask both of you, given your research, your expertise, if you were going to prioritize funding like the way we have to prioritize funding, where would you prioritize? Because we're being asked to potentially look at starting a whole new program for 4-year-olds and reconstructing the way that we delivered care from 0 to 3. Or do we continue with the same model and just continue to repair what damage was done over the last couple of years? I would like to hear both your thoughts about that.
Repair the damage. If you listen to my esteemed professor, if we just focus on 4-year-olds, we've missed the boat on the 0 to 4 to 5 continuum. And reaching our youngest kids in effective ways needs to be part of the strategy. So I know the state is also looking at how we do that. So we really need to, I think my urging is the 0 to 5 continuum, and being careful about not resourcing 4-year-olds differently in a way that you siphon resources away from younger kids, which has happened in other states, including your most qualified staff. I mean, we've had these issues locally in our implementation of PFA, where if you try to reward the teachers for teaching in a PFA class or a preschool classroom and they're getting paid more, then you're taking them away from 3-year-olds. That seems not to make a lot of sense. We want qualified staff for all of our kids. So really thinking about that continuum, you may have strategies around how to fund the system, but we need to make sure that it's a system and not siloed. And frankly, we've gutted so much of the system in the last several years, as you've outlined, as I've outlined. We really need to look at restorations to make sure that system, it's a robust system that we starved for years and needs some restorations.
And PFA, you're referring to our Preschool for All program in San Francisco?
The local program, which is just a layer on top of this system.
Assemblymember Ting, I would agree with much of what my colleague has said, although I would encourage you to think about, if you will, the destruction of a lot of child care slots and a lot of opportunities over the last few years as an opportunity for what I guess some people call creative destruction, and to build out of that a better system. I think if you simply think about backfilling what's been lost, you'll have missed an opportunity. And I think that both questions about quality, questions about targeting, are values questions. As I've said earlier, there is no question that the research shows that high-quality early education programs benefit kids who have the farthest to catch up with, while all kids benefit from a high-quality education experience. I will tell you as well that there are smarter people than I in many places around the country who are really thinking a lot about the infant-toddler part of that spectrum and how much of a foundation is being laid there that we have to be worried about, in some cases, undoing as kids get older. So the needs are great, the choices are difficult, but I urge you to be creative in thinking about how we might constitute a better system as we try to repair the losses that have taken place.
I would add to that one of the benefits of the TK proposal that we don't often see in our other parts of the system is that mixed income within the classrooms, and that is we have found that to be beneficial where we can build classrooms in neighborhoods and mix in private payers with state contracted slots. I think that does what in preschool and in early care what we want in public school is you want a mixed population.
May I just say one more thing, and I'll try not to blather on. There are also, I would urge you to consider, there are also some models that are emerging in other states and in other localities that are worth looking at in terms of developing creative ways of thinking about how do we get kids through these transitions? How do we create a seamless system that serves children's needs? And I can refer you to those if that would be helpful.
Just mention a couple without going into detail. So
Washington
we know
State is a
ourselves.
good example of an initiative that began in the legislature in the creation of policies, but also public-private partnerships to begin working in both building services, but also creating seamless transitions between services in cities like Seattle that has been accompanied by, again, private partnerships occurring at a more local level to really create a unique kind of a system there. That would be one of several examples. Oklahoma is another example of a state that, again, has used public-private partnerships to invest in particular in high-quality, very early care and education programs.
Thank you, Assemblymember Marisucci. If I had made opening comments, what I would have said is that I really do feel that we're at the place where we have to accept that value of providing high-quality care and education for 0 to 4 or 5 it's just been laid before us in terms of the data across the country as essential, and that just as both of you spoke to, that we now sort of have a random, yes, we have slots, we have programs, we have this or that, but we've not as a state taken on the challenge of how do we look at that need of infancy to before kindergarten, and how do we address it in a comprehensive way to help ensure success for all of our children. So to me, that should be our challenge. We can't solve that in one budgetary year. We need to do it over a course of a couple of years. We have programs such as Ms. Weber's bill for mandatory kindergarten, because now we're having to accept that we don't even have mandatory kindergarten in this state. We have bills that would ask for TK, but without my having to go into all of that, what I really heard clearly was that we need education and care and education, and we need high-quality programs for infancy to pre-kindergarten. So what you both sort of referenced, what your path would be in answer to Mr. Ting's question, but that is my question. What would you recommend as a path for California to pursue, to achieve, if that is our goal?
I think looking one at what other places have done that is successful, and looking at ways to retain the center-based program and how that interfaces with the voucher system is sort of one core area. I think we need to invest in workforce development in a serious way, and not get the cart before the horse in terms of what our higher ed institutions, how they're supported in developing the workforce, and they play such a critical role. So looking at the pieces and then laying out the strategy, I think the legislature has a strong notion about where we need to go. If your question is what do we do first, I think there's a number of things that have to be done, and you would need to decide incrementally. I think the rate restoration, obviously from my county's perspective, is a serious one that I don't know how long we can wait, quite frankly. And throughout the state where there's less of a supply, I think slots matter, just in terms of access. So thinking about what do you do in the interim as we build this more comprehensive system.
I would offer a somewhat different but a complementary perspective. One of the things that has impressed me as I've looked at communities and states that have begun to move creatively and effectively in this direction has been how important leadership has been, primarily coming from public officials. Often from the governor's office, which may or may not occur in this state, and oftentimes from others in higher posts. But the other thing that has been important is the enlistment of the business community, because it has often been those who are major employers in a state who have been at the front lines of arguing to legislative and executive office leaders, and also to the public, that it is important for us to reconceptualize how we think about early care, not just as a means of supporting adult workforce participation, but as a way of investing in the next generation of the workforce. And you can point to examples all around the country and the world. Sweden is one. Finland is my other favorite example. What has happened in Singapore as a result of a very explicit decision made by leaders a generation ago that they were going to invest in early childhood development as a way of springing the economic development of the community. Business leaders get that idea because they're fully aware of the difficulties of recruiting the kinds of workforce they need in this highly skilled, technologically oriented, information-driven age. And I think that, therefore, rather than thinking about what is the first program to do or what are the first funding cuts to restore, that building the momentum behind public-private leadership and using that as a way of galvanizing the public's interest in these issues would be the first step. And leadership is the absolute central ingredient to the programs that I've seen that have been successfully launched.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just kind of a comment first, if I might, about if we're, as Mr. Ting talked about, we have a competition for resources, obviously, and we have to make that decision as legislators in a broader sense of what are we spending money on. And my personal preference would be to see us extend a school year by 15 or 20 days before we put money in early childhood education, just because I think somebody mentioned Asian countries, what they do. I think they average 218 days of school each year, where we're at about 175 or 180. I think we have a long ways to go in that, and I think there's just as well a fair amount of pressure put on families when kids I don't get the point of taking 2 or 3 months off a year out of school. It makes no sense to me, so I think we should be investing in those and extending the school year. But also, Professor Thompson, if I could just challenge maybe your supposition, and maybe I didn't get it entirely right, and I think we all appreciate the stresses of poverty. There's no doubt about that. But I think if you look, once again, step back and look at the pressures on a child, you can certainly have, or I don't want to say that just because somebody's in poverty that they have extra stresses on their life. They may be doing quite well given the fact that they're poor. Psychologically, they may be doing fine just because of the atmosphere in the home. Because there are, I think, many other factors that you can have a very wealthy family that's very dysfunctional, that's going through their second, third, fourth divorce, that may have alcohol, drugs in the equation where they're fighting constantly and so forth, or one of the parents is working 12 hours a day, not home, not paying attention to the child, I think those stresses probably weigh heavily on a child as opposed to just poverty. And so I just wanted to see if you would comment on that.
Sure. Thank you for those comments, Mr. Assemblymember Standing. I think we have exchanged opinions in previous hearings on this issue before as well. So let me simply say that I certainly agree that early childhood stresses are not unique to children in poverty. But if we are thinking about the conditions that probabilistically impose stress on children, it's hard to argue against the compounding effects of poverty, simply because of what we know about the direct effects of poverty on the quality of parenting, on parents' involvement in their own depression, the effects of poverty on homelessness and the disruption that creates, the fact that families in very low-income circumstances are often having to move, requiring that children adjust to new homes, new friends, new schools, new care arrangements, the whole list. And what is striking, and the Brookings Institution is going to be publishing an article on this in May along with the policy brief, is what the neurobiological research is showing about the biological effects of poverty on kids. And what it's simply showing is that poverty gets under the skin very early on. So that kids are simply reacting to stressors at an exceptionally high degree. Their immune systems are being undermined as a result of chronic stress. And stress is affecting, in ways that we understand the neural pathways, the functioning of brain areas having to do with learning and memory. So when you have a child coming from a difficult background, which may but not necessarily is exclusively tied to poverty, that child may not have, may be having difficulty focusing their attention in a classroom, following instructions, managing their emotions, getting along with other kids. Not because they're obstinate or difficult or unruly or not wanting to cooperate, but because their brains have already been affected by heightened cortisol levels associated with many of the conditions associated, not exclusively, but often with poverty. So having reviewed that research, that is simply why I focus on poverty as I do. If we're trying to think of the one factor that accounts for early childhood stress, and that is also associated with low school achievement, that's not a bad place to go. The other thing is that I certainly would agree with you about the idea of extending the school year during the K-12 system. But I urge us all not to think about educational achievement and investments in this area as a zero-sum game. I certainly would not want to rob children at one age in order to invest in children at another. That would be self-defeating. My hope is that we can find the resources to improve educational achievement across a spectrum, realizing that it builds one upon another. What is it any good for a child if you have created a high-quality early education system and then you put them in poor schools? And I think that's part of your point. But the idea is not to try to pit one against the other, but to find the resources to create the seamless system that we so admire in other countries.
I agree. If I can, real quick, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
Just, I appreciate that. It understood what you just said, but there's still going to be competition for resources. And I appreciate what you're saying. You don't want to rub one in the air, but in reality, there will be competition for resources. And if I, just one quick comment on, and maybe I missed it, but I don't want to assume somebody just because they're from poverty, they have these circumstances or these learning conditions or something like that. I hope we agree that people may be somewhat impoverished but still be healthy and psychologically well. And as far as moving, I get distressed, and my colleague here can maybe talk about it. In the military, they move quite often. And I don't know if that's had adverse effects on children or not, but that's all I wanted to comment on. Appreciate you.
Okay, Ms. Weber, then Mr. Chavez. Let me remind our panel, though, that we're in the first of four
several
panels. So, yeah.
And I'm not going to belabor the point. I think I appreciate your comments. I think we had a resolution last year on the floor with regards to the value of early care and not trying to separate it out from preschool and all those other things, because it is very, very important. One of the things I think we would emphasize, and I totally understand the issue of poverty, and in California we're also talking about deep poverty. You know, there's a difference between being poor and being in poverty. My family was poor, but we weren't in poverty. And because my father had a job and we had those things, but we weren't wealthy people. But when you're in deep poverty and there doesn't appear to be a way out, and it does affect your thinking because you're moving all the time. We lived in the projects, we didn't move all the time. We were poor, but we didn't have certain other things that we needed, obviously. But being in deep poverty and seeing it, I've seen it in students, I've seen it when I've interfaced with kids in elementary school as mentors and others. I mean, there's just a different level of poverty, deep poverty, in terms of the constant movement, the inability to function, and you're totally dependent upon the state for care. And we have done some things, I think, in CalWORKs and other kinds of programs and that really have exacerbated the problem of poverty. And we have to be responsible in terms of what we're going to do with our budget as to how we're going to deal with that. I think you mentioned something that we've kind of keep skipping over a little bit, and that is 0 to 3 is very, very important. Both of you have mentioned that. And we often only rely upon the state in terms of state preschools and programs. We have to also do something about parenting and how we educate parents about the significance of 0 to 3, the role they play in helping with brain development. We haven't done a very good job of that. And every kid may not end up in a good preschool or a child care environment. But the question is, what do these parents know about the development of their children? And how do they interact with their children in terms of assisting them and development? And maybe what programs have we put in place that if you're not going to preschool, you go to some other kind of center that has more educational support in terms of learning and, you know, teaching children that. I mean, it's extremely important for young parents to understand that. I have grandkids, and so it's very, very important. My daughter sent me some note about you can't hold him anymore because he got to flip over. You know, I mean, you know, something like whatever. So no more hugs and kisses for Jaleel. You know what I'm saying? Everybody's got to let him do his tummy time and flip over and whatever else. So those things are very, very important. And she's a physician, so she understands all these things. But I hope every other parent understands it who's a young parent, so their children get the advantage of the kind of knowledge that's so essential. So I think we have to really start thinking out the box about what are we going to do as a state, as a message. And we do need a champion. You know, we need a champion for this cause statewide, because a lot of things we can do at the state, a lot of things are educational things that we need to teach parents and help them, and pamphlets and booklets and things that we share around. But I think you're onto it, 0 to 3, 0 to 5, but not really penalizing the other pieces. And I think that's what we have to think about in California, that it's not either this or that, but it really is an and. Thank you so much.
Mr. Chavez.
Well, I could go off and talk about being a grandparent of 4 kids, but grandchildren between 2 and 5, but I don't want to fall off in a speech. I'm going to ask a question. Looking at the families, do you have any data that shows the families, let's say, of 2014 compared to 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, through the decades? What's a family situation now that young children, 1 to 3, 1 to 4, are being brought up in California?
Assemblymember Chavez, families are changing, and there is beginning to be growing concern about the growing proportion of young single-parent families, mostly single-mother families, often of women who are not well prepared to be able to shoulder those responsibilities. And there's a lot of research being done now about how those families are taking shape, what are some of the social and economic processes that contribute to it. But the research is showing that children growing up in those contexts, particularly sons, seem to be at early disadvantage.
Do you have any numbers, data? You know, today, 30, 40, 50% of the children are being brought up in single-family homes compared to before or anything?
I don't have that information offhand, but I can get it for you.
I really would, because I think that's really the issue. I understand poverty, but I also think, you know, I was reading something the other day about young people not getting married till later, but hooking up and having kids, but, you know, not getting married. And I was talking to some young people, because, you know, a lot of them come through here, and I was asking them that, and they're pretty open on that issue of not getting married, but having a relationship and then having a child through the relationship. But it's just interesting, the mentality. So I'm wondering if there's something else going on. Maybe, Ms. Rutherford, you can talk about the Department of Defense program for early child education and NIAC accreditation. Do you have that understanding, that education, knowledge?
The Department of Defense program?
Yes.
So are you talking about the military child care program that, so, I mean, in the field, the military program is pointed to as a model of how the country could
Have you
it.
visited one?
I have not.
Okay,
I have
then I
not.
won't bother you with that. I actually ran them for a number of years. Was interesting sitting on a school board. When I was listening to a discussion about indicators that ensure children wouldn't do well in school, low economics, poverty, moving all the time, single-parent homes, mixed ethnicities in a family, mixed cultures. All those are indicators that a child would not do well in school. Of all the schools that we had about 20 of them in the school district. The one school that met all those criteria really high, that it would be a problem, had the highest academic performance. And the reason was because all those schools were on Camp Pendleton. And at Camp Pendleton, we have young people from other countries moving every year. One person is deployed. Actually, sadly, too common, somebody dying because of their job. But still, the children were doing well because we had the best child education program, NIAC accredited, because it was a recognition that the children needed to be protected and taken care of. So I think we in California need to look at this. I would like to be that leader to stand up for the state, having the experience in this, that our families are changing. People don't have the grandparents down the street. They may be across the state or across the country. We're very mobile. And there's some real issues going on that we need to look at the investment. And as a big supporter of K-12 and put more money in there, as a big supporter of higher ed, and we're not addressing that and how we fund it, I don't think that we need to balance those against the investment and the needs we need to do for child care for 0 to 5, because it's a changing society. We need to recognize it. And if we don't invest in it, those other things aren't going to do any good. And the only other thought that maybe, the deal of when I was in a council, one of the things I thought we did well was, and I don't know if it's around the state, maybe somebody can answer, local zoning, so that as we put business parks in, we ensure that there are sites encouraged to have child care centers there, so that when somebody would come to work, there would be a quality child care center, so that mothers who are breastfeeding, whatever, could take a lunch break and see their kid or whatever. But it was an idea, it was a way to attract businesses to the city by having zoned areas for child care centers within the industrial parks. Have you seen anything like that? I missed one of you?
Yes, and we have a number of places throughout the state have local strategies about how to develop care. I mean, I think the state has its own policy about creating new buildings and making sure that there's child care included in those buildings, and we're looking at local initiatives like that in San Francisco, and I know other places in the state do as well, because you have to have the space before you can make it quality. So yes.
It's just maybe something we as a group may want to sign off on a proclamation recognizing zoning, because actually it's local issues, not our issues. So I'll just end it on the, look forward to hearing the rest of the discussion. I think there's a lot of good models. I think DOD is one of them, and I think we need to understand it's not just an issue of poverty, it's also an understanding that our society is changing dramatically.
Thank you. I have one question I need to ask Professor Rutherford. Given your background, your expertise from 0 to 5 early childhood development, you mentioned earlier that that in response to Ms. Rutherford's clear statement, repair the system. You said don't just restore, don't just repair the system, but improve on the system. Right now, we don't have statewide leadership coming from the governor's office on early childhood education. What we do have is the Senate pushing this a proposal for a transitional kindergarten with a companion bill by Senator Liu for revamping the infant to toddler program. Good, bad, proceed with caution. What questions should we be asking as we are looking at this potentially a commitment of over $2.4 billion if we go down that direction that the Senate wants to go?